Hey everyone, it's Richard. You're watching The Plain Bagel. There's been a lot of talk about Alberta separatism lately. It started off as a fringe movement that slowly picked up steam, and thanks to changes made at the provincial level to make a referendum easier to have, the Alberta Prosperity Project, a non-profit pushing for independence, has started collecting signatures to put the question to voters as to whether Alberta should leave the rest of Canada. And as you can imagine, in the current environment, the whole thing has been pretty controversial. Canada is already facing a trade war from the United States and threats from Trump to turn the country into the 51st state via economic pressure. And news broke last month of separatists meeting with US officials to discuss a $500 billion loan to help the province transition to independence, something BC Premier David Eby likened to treason. Now, right from the get-go, it's worth highlighting these aren't elected officials, and only a minority of Albertans, between 19 and 29% according to recent polls, actually support independence to varying degrees, which, while high for Canada, is actually on par with some US states like California, and actually less than demand for independence from states like Texas and Alaska. And the Alberta Prosperity Project behind the referendum, the most vocal group in pushing for independence here, is very much a questionable organization, we'll call it. In their own marketing material, which starts with a quote of the US Declaration of Independence, the group laments about Alberta's, quote, downhill spiral into the vortex of the WEF UN Marxist agenda that'll be exacerbated by the proposed digital ID, programmable digital currency, and the ESG credit score to control every aspect of your life. And there are plenty of other examples of the group's co-founder Jeffrey Rath and CEO Mitch Sylvester saying pretty outlandish stuff. Yet this fringe group has been given quite the megaphone, especially among some within the mega crowd. Personalities on Twitter would have you believe that Albertans are dead set on separating or even joining the US, sharing videos of long lines in filled venues for referendum events, and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has even recently commented on working with Alberta as an independent country, all of which obviously raises anxieties about foreign interference from an administration that would actively benefit from a divided Canada. Now, ultimately, Albertans have every right to self-advocate in discussing their relationship with the federal government. But the current campaign being run by the Alberta Prosperity Project is built on misconceptions and misinformation, with the group making some pretty tall promises, saying they'll eliminate income taxes, sales taxes, save families tens of thousands of dollars a year, all with no grounding in reality and no consideration for the substantial risks and costs of secession. Which is why I wanted to cover the topic. I know this is a political issue and I don't usually like to cover the messy stuff, but I wanted to discuss the economic aspects that are often used to justify the idea of Albertan independence and really put them to some scrutiny, especially given the likelihood that we might face a vote here and the risk of misinformation from either Rath or Trump influencing people's decision. But before hopping into the messy stuff, let's start with a bit of a primer about Alberta. At the risk of sounding like a third grade Canadian geography teacher, Alberta is one of Canada's 3 prairie provinces, known for its agriculture, with the province making up nearly half of livestock and crop market receipts, and its landscapes, with the province hosting a range of the Rocky Mountains and Banff National Park, the first and top-rated Canadian national park. It's also home to the world's largest outdoor rodeo, the Calgary Stampede, and the world's largest statue of a dinosaur, named Tyra. Now, economically speaking, Alberta is most known for its oil and gas industry, with the province alone making up over 80% of the country's total oil production in 2024, thanks largely to its oil sands, which alone account for 98% of Canada's proven oil reserves. Now, the province isn't the biggest economy in the country. It represents about 15% of gross domestic product, compared to Ontario at 39% and Quebec at 20%. But the province's natural resources have helped the province consistently achieve the highest GDP per capita and average income among provinces. Now, as you might expect from a province that's sometimes called the Texas of the North, Alberta is fairly right-leaning when it comes to its politics. And with Canada having been run by Liberals since 2015, this has been the source of some tension over the past decade. Environmental policies like the carbon tax and burdensome approval processes for oil projects and a general lack of support for pipeline development from neighboring provinces has held back growth and investment for Alberta's oil and gas sector. And with the majority of Canadians living in Ontario and Quebec alone, some have argued that Canada is experiencing Western alienation, this idea that Eastern provinces are largely dominating politics for the country, something that has contributed to this growing separatist sentiment. Now, Canada is no stranger to separatist movements. In fact, the country's predominantly French province of Quebec has already had 2 referendums on independence, the latter of which just barely saw the province remain as a part of Canada in 1995, with the Remain vote winning by a sliver at 50.6% of the vote. But compared to Quebec, Alberta doesn't have the same deep roots or cultural concerns around things like language and the like. In fact, in all of its history, Alberta has only ever elected 1 separatist to its legislative assembly, whereas the Bloc Québécois, a national party dedicated to Quebec's sovereignty that's previously pushed heavily for separatism, was actually the official opposition from 1993 to 1997, and even today holds a good number of seats in the country's House of Commons. So then, what's driving the desire to separate now? Well, aside from the political grievance from a largely conservative province around a Liberal Party remaining in power after a long Justin Trudeau term, the arguments made are largely fiscal in nature, with one of the main points being around transfer payments. As mentioned, Albertan households have a higher average income, which, thanks to Canada's progressive tax system, also means they tend to pay higher taxes. A good chunk of this taxes goes towards transfer payments, which are distributed among the provinces to cover things like education, healthcare, and social services. But one of these transfers, known as equalization payments, is specifically designed to redistribute revenue from wealthier provinces to those with lower income, to quote, ensure that all Canadians have access to broadly comparable levels of public services. And these equalization transfers have been a point of frustration for the provincial government. While the amounts don't represent an explicit fee charged to Alberta, since all Canadians again face the same progressive tax rates, the province doesn't receive any amount from the transfers, making it a net contributor. And Alberta Premier Danielle Smith argues that when you consider all transfers beyond just equalization, Alberta sends out over $20 billion more annually to the rest of Canada than it receives back in benefits, an amount that represents an average of around $4,000 per capita. So there's this view that Alberta is subsidizing other provinces in the country, and there is some truth to that, with this view also extending to Alberta's contribution to the Canada Pension Plan. Much like how Social Security works in the US, every employee in Canada pays a portion of their paycheck towards the CPP. That amount gets matched by their employer and invested to help grow the pot. And when the employee retires, they're able to receive payments from the program depending on their age, contribution period, and their average earnings while they worked. Now, Alberta has a younger than average population, meaning that Albertans tend to make more contributions to the program than they see benefits redeemed. And because of the higher average income, some believe the province has made a disproportionate contribution to the country's pension plan. In fact, one 2023 LifeWorks report estimated that based on contributions, withdrawals, and historical performance, the province's share of CPP sat around $334 billion, representing roughly half of the entire country's plan. Now, the federal act that created the CPP actually allows provinces to leave with their share of the pot to start their own provincial pension plan. Quebec itself has been running an independent pension plan since the beginning. So, as you can expect, there's been a lot of demand to take this money and run. Now, we need to highlight that this calculation is very widely contested for reasons that we'll touch on. But the Alberta Prosperity Project estimates that even if the province ended up with just half of this amount, province could achieve a fiscal surplus of $23.6 billion to $45.5 billion by cutting off ties with Canada's federal government, even after accounting for the upfront costs and the ongoing expenses of replacing federal functions, which compares to the forecasted multi-billion-dollar deficits the province is expecting over the next few years. So you can see the appeal. It's argued that Albertan independence would both decrease taxes and increase the province's budgetary surplus, and eliminating the overhang of federal regulations could bolster investment and economic growth for the province, all of which sounds pretty compelling, except for the fact that it's completely unfounded. Yes, progressive taxes do lead to Albertans paying higher taxes since they earn, again, higher average incomes, and that is being used to help support other provinces in the country. New Brunswick, for example, sees nearly a quarter of its revenue paid for by other provinces via equalization transfers. But there's a whole slew of problems with the estimates being used by the Alberta Prosperity Project here. Dr. Trevor Toome, a professor of economics and director of fiscal and economic policy at the University of Calgary, for example, nice last name by the way, has himself pointed out a few issues with the report. Namely, the cost and revenue assumptions used to calculate these generous figures just don't make any sense. There are a number of oversights in the calculations. The group completely forgets about old age security and the Canada Child Benefit, essentially arguing that Albertans will continue to receive these payments without explaining where the $10 billion to fund these programs will ultimately come from. The group also assumes that Alberta could build an entire military presence for just a few $1 billion, even though the NATO target of 2% of GDP would put the annual spending alone at $10 billion a year, an amount that would eventually rise to $25 billion under the new phasing in of the 5% target. Meanwhile, on the revenue side, the group bases oil royalty estimates on an oil price of 85 Canadian dollars a barrel, which at the time of the draft was closer to accurate, given that oil prices spiked in the month the report was released. But today, the Western Canadian Select benchmark, what most Albertan producers receive for their oil, is sitting at just 69 Canadian dollars a barrel. But the most bizarre issue is that 16% of the Albertan government's revenue under this plan, about $23 billion, or essentially the entire fiscal surplus on the low end, appears to come from the returns and contributions by Albertans to the Canada Pension Plan. So I guess Alberta will just commandeer pensioner income to fund its independence. That also brings us to the issues with that calculation of Alberta's share of the CPP, because even with just using half of that estimate, the assumptions being used here just aren't realistic. In fact, if other provinces used the same assumptions that were used in the LifeWorks report, there wouldn't be enough money to go around. Ontario and Alberta alone would take up the entire pot of money. Reason being that the LifeWorks calculation is oversimplified and doesn't account for the full impact of withdrawals on investment returns, nor the influence of worker mobility. You see, it's very common for Canadians from other provinces to move and work in Alberta when they're young, especially in the oil and gas sector, and then retire and receive their government benefits in a different province, which has contributed to Alberta having the lowest age demographic among the provinces. But this can skew the numbers, making it look like Albertans are paying for the retirement of other Canadians, even if that isn't really the case. So even the Prosperity Project's 25% assumption is an aggressive estimate when you consider Alberta represents just 12% of the country's population and 16% of the CPP's contributions. So right away, there are some pretty glaring issues with the fiscal utopia that's being promised for Alberta's separation. Then there's the risks, downsides, and costs that haven't been covered here. For one, there's the pretty obvious issue of Alberta becoming a landlocked nation between Canada and the US, which, aside from the military and border implications, also presents a pretty big issue for trade. Alberta is already the most US trade-dependent province in Canada, sending the vast majority of its oil down south. And any access to Canada's west coast, where the province currently sells its oil to China, would have to go through British Columbia. So not only would Alberta immediately lose access to CUSMA and the Canadian Free Trade Agreement with other provinces, but it would also have to renegotiate these trade relations from a pretty disadvantaged position. And even without implementing explicit tariffs, it's likely that trade costs would increase. As highlighted by Dr. Toom, research on Brexit has found that non-tariff barriers increased by 3 to 8% for the UK after it left the EU, with estimates for the impact on GDP ranging from 2 to 5%. For Alberta, a 5% increase in trade costs alone could cause its economy to lose out on an estimated $20 billion annually. Secondly, there's a risk of capital and human capital flight here. The truth is that companies and investors don't like political instability, nor the risk of losing access to nearly 90% of Canada's population. So there's a good chance that we see companies and employees leave the province, thereby shrinking the tax base and hurting economic activity, even just on the threat of secession, something we actually saw firsthand with Quebec. From 1976 to 1979, while the Separatist Parti Québécois was in power, an estimated 368 businesses moved their headquarters out of the province, with even the Bank of Montreal moving to Toronto, Ontario. This is also an issue given Alberta's dependence on labor from other provinces, especially for its oil, gas, and construction industries. So any barrier on labor mobility is going to be a meaningful headwind here. Then there's the question of money. Like actual money. What would Alberta use as its currency if it were to separate? The Alberta Prosperity Project proposes that the province adopt the US dollar for some reason, and then eventually transition to its own Albertan dollar backed by gold, Bitcoin, and oil, but doesn't account for the cost of setting up those reserves, nor the risk of a province that's a fraction of the country's size launching a new currency from scratch. And truly, these are just some of the issues of the countless list of risks and costs that just aren't being considered here. Replacing infrastructure for healthcare, education, employment insurance, and pension funding. Establishing border patrol for a border that's now over 10 times larger than before. The development of a new legal and court system. The reestablishment of international relations without access to Canada's reputation and G7 status. Less favorable lending terms given the uncertainty. Alberta's share of federal debt that the Canada government might hitch on the province on the way out. The issue of federally owned land. You could kiss Banff goodbye because that's run federally, not provincially. The question of Indigenous rights in areas and the need to renegotiate there. The fact that since Quebec, Canadian law has been updated so that it no longer allows unilateral secession, meaning a yes referendum vote may not even lead to independence. And of course, the issue of 25% of the province's GDP coming from oil and gas, an incredibly volatile industry to base your economy off of. A big selling point for independence here is the idea that Alberta could deregulate and double down on its oil and gas sector to bolster economic activity. But oil can be pretty unreliable. The Albertan government's revenues from oil and gas have fluctuated from as low as 6.5% of their total income to as high as 33.2% in just the past decade alone. In fact, the Alberta government is currently bracing for higher deficits due to currently low oil prices. And we've seen the province struggle during oil gluts in the past. So while oil has historically been a great boon for the Albertan government, that might not always be the case. And one of the benefits of remaining as part of Canada is the industrial diversification it provides should things turn sour. Ontario, for example, has fluctuated between being a net contributor and a net recipient of equalization payments. And while it's true that Alberta has not received an equalization transfer since the 1960s, it may not always be able to rely on its above average GDP per capita and young demographics. Now, there are certainly valid criticisms of federal policies and how they are impacting Alberta. I mean, this is Canada we're talking about. We have a reputation of holding back our industries with red tape. But Alberta doesn't operate in a closed system, so it's actually quite difficult to accurately estimate many of these figures, to quantify its relationship with the rest of Canada when you consider things like labor mobility, military spending, and the federal tax credits and supports given to oil and gas companies that pay for Alberta's royalties. But what is almost certain is that secession would prove incredibly challenging for the province of Alberta. And it's very likely that it would cost more than it would save. Canada itself, of course, would suffer as well. Alberta is a very important economy and should be recognized for its contribution to the country. But independence could prove fiscally devastating for Alberta. Some may believe it's still worth it. We're really just talking about the economic considerations here. But a vote shouldn't be held under false pretenses. In 2016, there was a lot of misinformation and confusion about Brexit when just over 50% of voters chose to leave the European Union. In 2025, 5 years after officially leaving, polls suggest that the majority of respondents ultimately believe it was the wrong decision. Now, as mentioned, Albertan separatists do currently remain a minority in the province, and there is a good chance that the provincial government is using the movement as a bargaining chip in its relations with the federal government. Premier Daniel Smith has done things like reducing the number of signatures needed to put the referendum to a vote, while also talking about a united Canada. But with the onslaught of misinformation coming our way and likely to come our way in the future, especially if we approach an actual referendum vote, hopefully this video helped to clear the air. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please do make sure to like, subscribe, all that good stuff. It does help the channel tremendously. Let me know your thoughts on Alberta separatism, whether there are any points that you think were missed. Is it something you're strongly supportive of? Are you vehemently against it? Any and all thoughts, welcome in the comments down below. Thanks again for joining me, and as always, be safe out there.